It's my pleasure now to introduce Writing on the Midwest, a panel comprised of 4 individuals whose work might already be quite familiar to many of you. I'll introduce them in alphabetical order by last name. Bonnie Jo Campbell joins us this afternoon as a longtime Michigander. She currently lives in Kalamazoo, and she grew up on a small farm in a house her grandfather built. When she left home for the University of Chicago, her mother rented out her room, and since then she's hitchhiked across the United States and Canada, scaled the Swiss Alps on her bicycle, and traveled with the circus. She's led adventure tours in Russia and Eastern Europe, and after earning a master's degree in mathematics, Bonnie began writing fiction, receiving her MFA in creative writing from Western Michigan University. Her 2009 book, American Salvage, published by Wayne State University Press, was a finalist in fiction for both the National Book Award and the National Book Critics Circle Award. Phil Christman teaches at the University of Michigan and is the author of a widely praised essay titled On Being Midwestern, The Burden of Normality, which appeared in the fall 2017 issue of the Hedgehog Review, published by the Institute for Advanced Studies in Culture at the University of Virginia. Melissa Fraterrigo is the author of the novel Glory Days, published in fall 2017 by the University of Nebraska Press, and a short story collection titled The Longest Pregnancy, published by Livingston Press. Her fiction and nonfiction has appeared in more than 40 literary journals and anthologies, from Shenandoah and the Massachusetts Review to Story South and Notre Dame Review. Melissa has been nominated for numerous literary awards, including 2 Pushcart Prizes. She teaches classes on the art and craft of writing at the Lafayette Writers Studio in Indiana. Meghan O'Gieblyn's essays, including Midwest World and Dispatch from Flyover Country, have appeared in numerous publications, including Harper's Magazine, N+1, The Point, The New York Times, The Guardian, and The New Yorker, in addition to other venues. She received her bachelor's degree at Loyola University Chicago and her MFA from the University of Wisconsin at Madison. And in October of this year, Penguin Random House will publish her forthcoming book, Interior States. Please help me welcome these distinguished writers to Grand Rapids.
So we get up and talk in our alphabetical order? Is that what we do? Okay. And I'm going to stand up, because if I don't stand up now, I won't get to for a long time. And it is recorded. I would normally just pace around, but since you guys are recording this? Yeah, okay. Thank you. Thank you all for coming. You go to these conferences, and really what you want to do is just slack off and wander the halls and stuff after the first couple panels, but thank you. This is sort of like wandering the halls, actually, being here. I'm from the Midwest, where the work of our country gets done, where the cheap beer of our country gets drunk. My 5 books of fiction take place in the Midwest, in Michigan to be precise. Though I met my husband in Boston 35 years ago, I now have all my sex in the Midwest. My husband was lured here by my descriptions of parking spaces galore. I told him, I was like, hey, hell, half the time, Chris, we just park on the lawn. Now he has a pole barn that is bigger than your house, full of tractors and the tools to fix those tractors. We call his pole barn the Tractorium. My husband's brother moved here as well, which is to say the Midwest can be contagious. Like all Midwesterners, I am not special. I'm like everybody else, and so of course I do not have an accent. Easterners and Southerners and Northerners and Westerners have accents, but not us. If you want to know why I sound the way I do, read the article in Belt magazine by Edward McClellan about the Northern Cities vowel shift, where he talked about this. I interpret this to mean that he linked to an interview with me, and I interpret this to mean that the way I talk is extremely not special. As a writer, language is important to me. I'm interested to hear the people around me say, the dishes need washed. And right now, my lawn needs mowed. I wear gym shoes, and I travel the expressway. I eat pasties, and when I hit myself on the head because I forgot to buy pop at the store, I say, oh. Of course, I would rather eat swamp mud than speak with confidence. Or, as we say, put on airs. And I would rather hack off my left arm with a dull hacksaw than go to the therapist, though most of my East Coast and West Coast friends think I need one. I'd rather clean the manure spreader with a Q-tip than suggest I am one whit smarter or better in any way than my brother, the custodian, or my sister, who is also a custodian. As a Midwesterner who wants to tell stories, I know that my own life isn't any big deal. And I have been raised better than to tell other people's private business. So it should be no surprise that I make things up and that I write fiction. As a fiction writer, my job is to create situations and scenes that are both plausible and interesting. And plausible means I have to be historically accurate. I live at the edge of Kalamazoo in a neighborhood of very small houses built after World War II. And I ride my bike at night for a little thrill. And I look into people's windows as I pass. A plausible scene I would write for a contemporary story would be a scene of someone sitting and watching a big flat screen TV on the wall of a very small living room. Interesting, on the other hand, is an alien abduction occurring next door to the house. Plausible and interesting is a man turning up the TV so as not to hear another man beating his wife next door, or beating his teenage son who just broke into your house, or beating his little 9-year-old daughter, or his dog who has just bitten his sweet little 9-year-old daughter. And maybe the 9-year-old daughter, if she is being beaten, can't face that her father, a Methodist minister, beats her. And so she tells her friends at school that she was abducted by aliens. In order to write that scene, I have to know what would be on television at that time of night, 8 p.m. or maybe it's 2 a.m. That's information I can get from a TV guide. But if I put that story in 1970 or 1950, I have to know what was on television at that time and also what shows people tended to watch. And I have to know the laws about child abuse and spousal abuse. And we need to know the habits of the community. Beating a child looks different in Huck Finn than it does in Ann Arbor today. Beating one's wife was treated as a lighthearted subject in British fiction for centuries. And to hear that the child beater is to hear what the child beater is shouting, we need to know the way people talk in that neighborhood and region at that time. I might also need to know something about the Methodist Church and the community. And I need to know what objects would be in the living room, starting with what kind of TV they would be watching. And I have to do all of that before I can even begin my work of giving the characters their unique traits and creating a fictional story out of it. And if a version of this story takes place 80 years ago and there's no TV, I need to go to the historians to find out what noise people in the house would make in order to not hear the beatings next door. If there's a birthday party for an 18-year-old boy in Southern Illinois, then it could be a happy thing to learn he's an adult. But if it's 1863 or 1967, then it means somebody is probably preparing to go off to war. And I have to remember that as a writer. Even taking a drink of water from the kitchen sink means something radically different if it's 2015 Flint, Michigan. Have any of you bought a house and then discovered the place on that property where people dump their garbage? As a writer, I know how a contemporary reader is going to react when she reads about somebody tossing garbage out into the backyard. But this is the kind of thing that I might need to use in my work. But I have to know how people treated refuse. I have to know what they did with their garbage at different times in history. And I love, one of my favorite things to learn about historians and archaeologists was that they look down into latrines, which we do as fiction writers too. Whether or not we're writing historical fiction, our stories are full of the past. Because all but our youngest characters have lived in the past, and our narration always has to show an understanding of the past. Science fiction might be futuristic, but think how much the understanding of it depends on knowledge of Nazis or Soviet Russia or biblical times. I do wish I had my own team of historians, so let me know if any of you want to sign up with me. I really needed it when I was writing my first novel that had a little tiny portion of it taking place right at that period of time in this part of the country where for us it was a Potawatomi, because I'm from Kalamazoo, and then the white European settlers came. And there was about a 20-year period where everybody was living there. And I could find out surprising little information about what that time was like. You know, who was sleeping with who, you know, that kind of stuff. So we writers need you historians, and I have a lot of questions. But you did not invite me here to ask you questions. You invited me here to let you know how the Midwest makes a writer. Well, we are the middle of the country. We are the heart of the country, the lung, the spleen, and the reproductive organs of the country. And our profound influence is everywhere. And though we keep quiet about our influence, well, we keep quiet about our influence because we know humility is a virtue. And we know that getting on a high horse usually results in falling off the other side of that high horse after a few drinks. I'm just saying, if you go to New York or LA, most of the interesting and helpful people you will meet there will turn out to be from Ohio or Indiana. The way I see writing, it is about helping people see something they might not have seen otherwise. In the Midwest, we are a land of many lakes. Really big lakes, small lakes, even smaller lakes. 10,416,007 lakes, to be exact. Haha, I'm a fiction writer, so I made that up. And don't even get me started on the ponds. We are a land of many farms, and in those farms are many fields, and writing is one of those fields. Probably a disproportionate number of your favorite writers are Midwesterners or are from Ontario, which we consider Ontario the Midwest of Canada. Kurt Vonnegut, F. Scott Fitzgerald, Joyce Carol Oates, Hemingway, Louise Erdrich, Gwendolyn Brooks, Marilyn Robinson, Jane Smiley, Toni Morrison, Irma Bombeck, to name a few, and she was very helpful, Irma Bombeck. For certain, most of the nation's reading gets done in the Midwest. Every Midwestern woman worth her salt is in a book group, or has been in a book group, or is looking for a good book group right now, one in which the other women don't care how much wine she drinks. Take my mother. She reads a book a day and especially loves books in which men are killed or in which menopausal women steal bulldozers and drive them over men's cars. Or if it's historical fiction that women steal horse wagons and then drive them over hired men. Most men in the Midwest are unemployed or addicted to methamphetamine, and so can't pay their cable bills, and so their TV screens have turned to fuzz. So what the heck else are they going to do besides read? You know, I had this whole topic, after I wrote this, I was like, a whole topic I want to talk about, fake history. You know what? A lot of people are sitting around just living off fake history, and we could all come talk to me about that, because I'd like to hear what you guys think about that. That history where, like, wolves killed people all the time in Michigan. So, okay. We Midwesterners go about sheepishly shuffling along in our winter parkas that cover our giant asses, but we have nothing to apologize for. We have everything that anybody else has in this country right here, except maybe mountains. But we have complicated cloud formations that, after a few drinks, resemble mountain ranges. The Southern grotesque is a kind of writing we hear about, but I claim our writers are just as grotesque as the Southern writers. If you drive down the road, you will see we have the wide spaces of the great American West, and we even have rattlesnakes here. the Massasauga rattler, to be exact, who has adjusted very well to life in the swamp. And just around the corner from the swamp, we have restaurants in Ann Arbor and Chicago that are just as crowded and overpriced as restaurants on the East Coast. We make delicious food here that comforts you, and we really know how to melt cheese. We are nice in the Midwest. We are sometimes passive-aggressive, but we only fight you after a few drinks, and only if you are asking for it. We are wholesome. Even our sluts are wholesome. I married my Boston husband in Kalamazoo at the courthouse. The woman who made my wedding cake was a slut. And she frosted the whole cake with a cigarette in one hand and a beer in the other. We are humble. We are wise. We are wide and growing wider. We are the Midwest. Writing is a discipline that requires us to sit on our asses for long periods of time without television. Writing requires humility. We are very well suited. You betcha.
In the spirit of humility, I will say, I don't think I can top that. I think nothing has shadowed my development as a writer more than my failure to have had an interesting childhood, such as writers are supposed to have had. I spent most of it watching television. As for adolescence, my main memory of it is of a pervasive boredom and a sense that interesting things only happened elsewhere and to other people, that I was doomed forever to be entering rooms moments after someone had said something funny or cool, learning about parties only on the following Monday, befriending a group of people only long after its best anecdotes. Remember when we climbed on top of the middle school and the cops chased us? Remember when we tricked those freshmen into smoking parsley? Well, we're already long established. I felt about my hometown the way a person with only one book comes to feel about that book. Maybe it's a very large book. Maybe it's an almanac. Still, sooner or later, its familiarity becomes more alarming than reassuring. You feel sick of knowing every paragraph, oppressed by the possibility that the world is actually small enough to fit inside your head. The sense of an unchanging everydayness at times became so strong that it became like a kind of depression. Looking back, I can assign many causes to these feelings of everydayness, boredom, limitedness, and belatedness. I can chalk them up to economics. I had the kind of working class childhood that leaves you with a pervasive sense of limitations and a terror of bank tellers, and a real intimidation when trying to sleep in the Amway Grand Hotel, by the way. But not the kind that leaves you with like a lot of cool stories that make you sound inspiring and badass. I can chalk it up to personal psychology, family trauma. I can certainly chalk it up in part to my family's worldview. They were the sorts of Christian fundamentalists who had a Bible answer with which to answer, a Bible quotation with which to answer every possible question, so that it extinguished the sense that there could be any sort of mystery or undecidedness about things. It was kind of a case of religion as the death of all properly religious feeling. So I can chalk it up to all of these things, and I can chalk it up partly, as I did in my essay, to the pervasive idea of the Midwest as sort of the or standard America. But I didn't have these explanations at the time. All I felt was the heaviness. In adolescence, to relieve this heaviness, I ran. When I ran, it was as if the map of the place that existed in my head got rearranged and reordered. I knew where every road ended and where every intersection happened, but when I ran, I felt as though I didn't know these things anymore. Every square on the map was somehow heightened, every familiar house strangely lit up or weirdly shadowed. I would run long till that map was obliterated, and then I'd run back again, like a dog with one of those electronic collars. When I think of what the Midwest gave my imagination, I think first of the way that this landscape suddenly shifted in those moments, the way that I suddenly felt that I didn't know it. It's not only the flatness that writers like Michael Martone and Marilyn Robinson have described so well, how it makes the world into a kind of stage or showcase or theater of the glory of God or of humankind or of the inexplicable, but also a duality. You're looking at a flat field, a thing that just lies there that has nothing to do but be patently itself, and you suddenly realize that that flat square also contains more things than you can possibly fully see at once. By laying itself out for you, it also exhausts your seeing and forces you to confront that exhaustion. It forces you to realize how little you see of what you see. And this estrangement doubles back on yourself, as in Willa Cather's famous sentence, "Between that earth and that sky, I felt erased, blotted out." It's the sense of a sudden toggling between a picture that is indescribable in its banality and one that is indescribable because it is too strange and complex to fully absorb. This is probably the single thing that is most important to me as a writer. It's the idea that mystery doesn't have to be sought, just noticed, that we are not terminally disenchanted beings roaming a landscape of atomization and anomie. That everything, as my hero Marilyn Robinson has also said, always bears looking into. That we know our places or our jobs or our families or ourselves only in a way that does not preclude those destabilizing but also beautiful moments in which we sigh and say, did I ever really know so-and-so? My favorite writers, and a lot of them do tend to be Midwesterners, are people who can make a reader doubt the map of the world that they carry in their heads. They take it that the obvious description is the wrong one. I believe in that with religious intensity, and it makes writing very hard. I will deliver this talk on Wednesday. I'm finishing it on Tuesday because the line between a too obvious phrasing and a too obscure one is like one of those tiny hairs that gets caught in the print of an old film, and it squiggles and flickers and it jumps here and there on the screen and then disappears entirely and then reappears in another corner of the frame just when you've forgotten about it. I fear the obvious so much that it has gotten in my way as a writer, and it has sometimes made me ridiculous in my personal life. So determined was I to find the complex secret meaning behind my own or someone else's bad feelings or behavior. I once had a roommate who drank alcohol constantly, stole a 20 off my dresser to buy alcohol, and insisted, most damningly, that he wasn't an alcoholic. So naturally, I agreed with him that he wasn't an alcoholic. It would be reductive and limiting to impose such a loaded term to put the species ahead of the variation in that way. He wasn't an alcoholic. He was, like all beings, a one-off, a miracle, an unrepeatable microtone in an infinite scale. Indeed, but he was also an alcoholic, and I needed that 20. You could almost call it a counter-satirical impulse, insofar as classical satire, in the sense of the term that we kind of trace back to like Aristophanes, consists of reducing everything to the most ridiculous possible version of itself and then smashing these stock figures into each other at high speeds so that when the dust clears, nothing is left but the status quo ante. I recently read for the first time a novel that I had always heard described as a kind of satirical vision of the Midwest, Evan Connell's Mrs. Bridge. It's set in Kansas City between World War I and World War II. It's written in tiny vignettes between a paragraph and a few pages long, each of which has an ironic or sardonic or merely neutral title. This is a scene where the title character runs into a well-known acquaintance. On a downtown street just outside a department store, a man said something to her. She ignored him. But at that moment, the crowd closed them in together. "How do you do?" he said, smiling and touching his hat. She saw that he was a man of about 50, with silvery hair and rather satanic ears. His face became red, and he laughed awkwardly. "I'm Gladys Schmidt's husband." "Oh, for heaven's sake," Mrs. Bridge exclaimed, I didn't recognize you." The title tells us why this is funny. Never speak to strange men. The point, of course, is that everybody is strange. Only context makes us think otherwise. Now, this is a comic passage in a book that is frequently very funny, but the comedy is in unknowing. The fact that Mrs. Bridge can't recognize someone that she has known for decades, for example. That is the joke at the heart of the novel as well, that everybody is strange to Mrs. Bridge, and she, in turn, is a stranger to everybody. Nobody really knows her, including herself. As the book's first sentence tells us, she is never able to get used to the sound of her own first name. The comedy of the book is precisely not satirical in the sense of reducing Mr. or Mrs. Bridge or any of the other characters to types at whom we are invited to laugh. The comedy is in the gap between these characters on the one hand and the inadequate strategies they use to understand each other on the other. Mrs. Bridge is often described as a middle-class housewife, and when you put down the book, you no longer really believe in the words middle class or housewife. You want words that open up rather than words that settle. Such as it is, this is my poetics. It's nothing too fancy. A person in a satirical mood might say it's just Russian formalist defamiliarization with a little bit of mainline Protestant uplift thrown in. It's also my politics and my ethics, such as those are. I try not to understand people too quickly. I try not to thrust limiting assumptions on other people. I try to let people surprise me. I mostly fail at these things. And sometimes they feel really irrelevant in a historical moment when so much of the evil around us is unsubtle and simple. Donald Trump is horrible in part because of his seeming determination to actually be the one-dimensional thing that he presents to the world. Last week, I read an essay with a very provocative title, "We Need to Stop Pretending Solving Climate Change is Complicated." Very good, I recommend it. And in fact, the title is correct. It's not complicated. You just increase urban density, build up, not out, switch mostly to renewables, throw the oil company bums out. Simple. It's very, very, very hard. So much about our historical moment looks bad because it is bad. But by that same token, I think that if there is any hope for those of us who live in such a moment, it is precisely where, to my mind, literature and beauty have always resided, in the things that aren't obvious, even though they are right in front of us, somewhere in the calm mystery of what is. Thank you.
Thank you, Phil, and panelists and Grand Valley State for being here and having this opportunity to speak to you, historians, about my hometown, the Midwest. I grew up in Lansing, Illinois. It's a suburb south of Chicago. Some of our neighbors worked construction while others bussed tables at the Golden Bowl, where on Saturdays my grandma would take us for club sandwiches and palm-sized dishes of cottage cheese. I did not know anyone who wrote anything other than checks to pay bills, and yet from the very start, I wanted nothing more than to be a writer. Since then, I've spent a good deal of my life working jobs that meant nothing to me, scribbling alone in coffee shops, trying to prove that the desire to write is warranted. It wasn't until I left my hometown that I realized that the act of writing serves a function that is just as necessary as our neighbor who fixed air conditioners and each fall turned into the driveway with the crumpled carcass of a deer in his truck bed. Being a Midwesterner has shaped the way I approach the page, as evidenced by my current novel, Glory Days. The small town of Ingleside is populated by down-on-their-luck ranchers and new money, ghosts and seers, drugs and greed, the haves and the have-nots. At the center of this novel is the story of Teensy and his adopted daughter, Luann, who at the book's opening face the loss of their land as they mourn the death of Luann's mother. When it becomes impossible to make a living farming, developers buy up acreage and erect an amusement park, Glory Days, and this ushers in dark times. If there's one thing I've heard from readers in the 8 months since the book's release, it is that Glory Days is a dark book, a gritty book, and yet how could it not be? In the winter of 2011, a few months after moving to Indiana, after spending a year landlocked in Philadelphia, someone very dear to me was diagnosed with cancer. Writing had always been a means for me to make sense of the world, and now I was unable to read a paragraph, much less write one. I slept poorly, and rather than tossing and turning, I got out of bed and read poetry. I found myself fascinated by how images electrified a scene and could even reflect a character's emotional state. So as I was becoming more conscious of details on the page, I was also becoming more aware of Indiana and the place where I now lived. The small towns and farms that surrounded my new home became a turning point for my work. One day, while visiting our local library, the parking lot attendant told me he'd just come back to town, that he'd been south burying both his mother and sister. I don't know whether it was the look on his face or something else, but I heard a line. Gardner hears dogs scrambling up the trees after a squirrel or a neighbor's cat, he tells himself, eager to be calmed. This became the first line to Teensy's daughter. Only unlike previous stories I had written, the more I wrote, the more I realized that these were not simply stories. The small town of Ingleside linked them, and they were also linked by a set of characters. I was no longer writing stories, but a book. Within the first few paragraphs of Teensy's daughter, we are introduced to Gardner, who is on house arrest for causing the death of the daughter of his childhood nemesis, Teensy. And later, on the same page, we meet Luann, Teensy's daughter, who has been haunting Gardner. The chapter appears 3/4 of the way through the book. I was introduced to these characters at a later point in their lives, and I had to work in reverse to discover what had occurred to cause their current predicament. I learned that Teensy and Gardner were childhood enemies, and that Gardner's family took in Teensy following a fire that claimed most of his family. I learned that Teensy never felt more himself than when he was raising beef cattle. I learned that Luann, who was adopted, desperately wants to belong, and that this ache presented itself when Teensy lost his wife, Luann's mother, as well as his land. Novel in stories, story cycle, composite novel, whatever term you prefer to use, this form welcomes readers' thoughts and impressions, and I know I could not have written it without my Midwestern roots and how such background encouraged me to pay attention to the reader. Robert M. Lucier describes the novel in stories as a volume of stories collected and organized by their author, in which the reader successively realizes underlying patterns of coherence by continual modifications of his perceptions of pattern and theme. He continues, within the context of the sequence, each short story is thus not a completely closed formal experience. The volume as a whole becomes an open book, inviting the reader to construct a network of associations that binds the stories together and lends them cumulative thematic impact. In the 6th chapter of Glory Days, Luann finds herself under the spell of Footer, a character some readers have rightfully called a sociopath. Footer tells Luann about her birth father, and she believes him. Your first day on earth was almost your last, he says. Your birth father's name is Kincaid, and he has sent me here to find you. Footer says her parents were poorer than most and that they lived like wild animals in an abandoned hunting cabin not far from the river. They feasted on seeds and nuts, creatures that slithered in the grass. Your mother grew large with you while the rest of her shriveled up, until at the end she could no longer walk, and your father lifted her and held her legs on the riverbank. You slid into the water like a fish, nearly swam past his hands. You're making that up, she says. Am I? Footer lords this perceived knowledge over Luann, especially as his behavior grows increasingly odd and violent. But she is high on his lies, and when Footer steals her from Teensy's house in the middle of the night, there is the sense that Luann's relationship with Footer will only become more troubled. Several years have passed in the chapter that immediately follows. It is fall, and Luann awaits the arrival of the police. Here we learn that Luann and Footer are in hiding. All summer, she and Footer had been getting their kicks from snatching kids from Glory Days. But something goes terribly wrong, and Luann, who has finally had her fill, calls the cops on Footer. As she waits for the police to arrive, she thinks about her dad. The last time she had seen Teensy, she was pregnant, and Teensy had brought her and Footer food. At this time, she was still wrapped up in Footer's spell, and when her dad had offered to help her, she refused. "Let me take you to the doctor in Streetmore," he said. "No one needs to know." And before she knew what was happening, Teensy crouched down, turned his face to the side, and pressed it against her stomach. She tried to push him away, but he held her hips. She couldn't recall the last time she'd been touched by him, and she felt both drawn to his familiarity and frayed by the ghosts those hands had touched. Several years have elapsed since the previous chapter when Luann first meets Footer. Yet a certain amount of space exists between the chapters so that the book invites readers to bring forward their own beliefs and participate in the book's meaning-making. Some novel and stories are very closely aligned to the novel, where various elements in the narrative fit together to create a succinct whole, whereas other translations of the form include more ambiguity, with greater leaps of time and situations. In Glory Days, I worked to connect the pieces between these characters and their somewhat tragic situations, while also acknowledging that some time gaps remained in the narrative. My hope was that readers would feel welcome to fill in these gaps. Some chapters in the book lean towards speculative fiction, and I think this is due to the uncertainty of that time in my life. Fredonia the Great is about a female seer, Fredonia, who is skilled in the way of laying hands, allowing her to experience the deaths of those living or dead. But the chapter is really about grief and having a power unlike others. Such magic, as writer Benjamin Piercy says, clarifies our everyday struggles and allows us truths that might otherwise be unavailable. When I discovered Fredonia has this power, I wasn't quite certain how she fit with Teensy and Gardner and Luann, but as I focused on what I knew about Ingleside and its reliance on the land, I worked backwards from Teensy's daughter to figure out why Teensy and Gardner had such animosity toward one another, and I also needed to understand why Teensy was so financially hard-strapped. I knew it had something to do with the farmland and the fact people were cut off from the land. Once I realized that outsiders move in and erect an amusement park, I was able to combine both fantastic elements with more realistic components. Novelists often fatten their stories with exposition, but in Glory Days, I worked hard to make the prose lean. Writing chapters out of order encouraged me to look for clues and connections, to consider how the past haunted the present and how one's identity, whether it be as a farmer, a seer, a daughter, or even a ghost, shapes our expectations for ourselves as well as others. When I left for graduate school to study fiction, my dad did not hide his disapproval. "Fiction is not real," he said as I packed my car. "What you're doing is not real." I didn't have a response for him then, but between then and now I've learned that when you invite a reader to bring his or her own impressions to a book, the fiction becomes as legitimate as punching a time clock or diapering a baby. It develops into an experience, and experiences change us. Where you're from matters. It's compelled me to try and deepen the reader's connection to Glory Days through the novel and stories form in hopes of proving that writing is not only a worthwhile profession, but also one that can be distinctly Midwestern. Thank you.
All right, I just wanted to say thanks again to John Locke and Scott St. Louis for putting this panel together. This is my first time at this conference, and it's a real honor to be part of this conversation with so many writers that I admire. On November 9th of 2016, the day after a historic national election, a dozen ABC executives gathered at the network's headquarters in Burbank, California, to revise their strategy. ABC, whose slogan is America's Network, has long seen itself as the bastion of mainstream national tastes. But the election of Donald Trump revealed that there was another America out there, one they had patently ignored and presumably failed to capitalize on. The network's president recalls of the meeting, quote, "We looked at each other and said, there's a lot about this country we need to learn about here on the coasts." Their solution was to reboot Roseanne, a sitcom a sitcom about a white working-class family set in the fictional town of Lanford, Illinois. The first season, which aired this spring, showed the Connor family fretting over healthcare costs, griping about liberal relatives, and anxiously spying on their Muslim neighbors. Like much television these days, the plot points were so of the moment, so calculated to strike a political nerve, that it was easy to read its characters in their small Illinois town as shorthand for the other half of America, or what is often called in cosmopolitan sectors, the real America. The real America has always been a fiction, but it's telling that the Lanford of Rosanna is located in the Midwest, a place that has been home to so many imaginary archetypes of small-town America. If Main Street and Middletown served this role in eras past, Lanford has come to define the Midwest of the Trump era, at least as it exists in the national imagination. It is a place that is overwhelmingly white and culturally barren, occupied by people who are consumed with resentment and nostalgia. These stereotypes, of course, are not particularly new. Watching Roseanne, I often thought of Alfred Kazan's description of the Midwest at the dawn of World War II, when he decried the provincialism, ugliness, and bitterness of small-town life. But the ABC meeting was also animated by a kind of curiosity. Just as the network executives saw the election as an opportunity, a chance to pioneer a new market, there is at the moment a renewed interest in the region as a place that coastal residents who readily identify themselves as bubble dwellers should probably be reading about, if only as a dreary civic duty. This moral imperative has propelled the success of books like J.D. Vance's Hillbilly Elegy and Kathy Kramer's The Politics of Resentment, which sought to explain the politics of rural America to a perplexed liberal readership. As someone who writes about the Midwest and was shopping my essay collection in those confused early months of 2017, I was often told by New Yorkers that my book was timely and relevant. We want to move fast, one publishing house reportedly told my agent, while there's still interest in the Midwest. That's true. Perhaps in another era, I would not have found it discomfiting to be pegged as a Midwestern writer, but in 2017, the label felt onerous. It suggested that my work was going to be read as a handbook of sorts, a primer for curious outsiders. The hat of anthropologist is a particularly heavy burden for writers, and I had sensed its strain, this duty to explain, to generalize, in the work of regional authors far too often. I worried, too, that interest in my writing meant it had succeeded as stereotype, that I was simply mirroring back to the coast images of Middle America I gathered subconsciously from the popular culture that was produced there. I come from a very particular place, Muskegon, Michigan, that has its own history and a unique set of economic and political problems. But I knew all too well the temptation as a writer to ignore precisely what was most unusual and interesting about my experience, and reach instead for images that would be easily legible to readers: the abandoned factory, the truck stop diner, the lonely whistle of the freight train. But how does one capture a place as vast and layered as the Midwest? The region I know has many places that resemble, at least superficially, Lanford, Illinois. But it also contains wealthy resort towns and prosperous suburbs. It contains Bronzeville and East Detroit and Ferguson, Missouri. It is home to Madison, Wisconsin, an incubator of the Progressive Party, and Dearborn, Michigan, the largest Arab American community in the United States. I recalled that the novelist Dawn Powell once claimed that she wrote about turn-of-the-century Midwest to show, quote, that in a small radius of 100 square miles in northern Ohio, there's a half a dozen different types of civilization: a Finnish town, a Dutch town, a rubber town, a steel town, grain farms, fruit farms, German towns, etc. How many writers throughout history, I wondered, had tried to call attention to the plurality of such places? How many times had they failed or been ignored? Some critics I knew had proposed that we stop speaking of the Midwest as a region at all, not only because of the myriad cultures that occupy these states, but because regional ties in an era of digitalization have become less binding than the online communities to which we belong. Don't all of us now live in the rarefied ether of the internet, citizens of the globe? But I continued to believe, for reasons I could not quite articulate, that it was important to speak and write of the Midwest as a region. In O Pioneers, Willa Cather observes of her heroine It is in the soil that she expresses herself best. It seems to me that Midwestern writers have always expressed themselves best in the soil, which is to say when they focus on the landscape of these interior states and the political, racial, and cultural borderlines that continue to divide it. No corner of American soil is clean. That of the Midwest is bloodied with Native genocide, ecological devastation, and racial segregation. And the best examples of our regional literature are rooted in this blighted ground. Just as Cathars, Nebraska is scarred by railroads, rising land costs, and the inequities of the Homestead Act, so the Detroit of Angela Flournoy's Turner House is riven by redlining and racist real estate pacts. But there's a paradox here. The more a writer diverges from popular archetype and focuses on the particulars of place, the less likely she is to be considered a Midwestern writer. I was in the process of thinking over these questions last winter when I came across the work of Marguerite Young, a mid-century writer from Indiana. Young, who died in 1996, has mostly been forgotten, though she's known among her cult followers for her 1,200-page novel, Miss Mackintosh, My Darling, a modernist epic set in southern Indiana that is every bit as expansive and ambitious as Joyce's Ulysses. Young was also an essayist, and one of her most famous essays now, like her fiction largely forgotten, is called The Midwest of Everywhere. It begins like this. The Middle West is probably a fanatic state of mind. It is, as I see it, an unknown geographical terrain, an amorphous substance, the ghostly interplay of time and space, the cosmic, the psychic, as near to the North Pole as to the Gallup Pole. She goes on to say, I would have to include in my own concentric definition of the Middle West, Xanadu, India, Byzantium, China, the lost Atlantis, everywhere, 12 unseen moons shining over the planet Jupiter, all countries, all continents, all possibilities, the impossible. She goes on to describe a number of fantastic sights she supposedly witnessed firsthand in the Midwest. Elephants browsing the banks of the Wabash River, an entire town populated by deaf people, a dead whale in a boxcar stranded in the middle of a cornfield. Young insisted to the end of her life that she had not embellished these details, which drew wry smiles from many interviewers and aggravated to no end the fact-checkers at Mademoiselle who published the essay. But these moments of hyperbole had their purpose. Young was writing in response to the regionalists who were popular in her day, disciples of Sinclair Lewis, who had reduced the region to a bland caricature. The Midwest, she knew, was far more strange and mystifying, and she called on writers not to look for the mean or the average, but rather the odd, the unexpected, which is another way of saying the local, the particular. She writes, quote, for me, a plain Middle Westerner, there is no middle way. I am in love with whatever is eccentric, devious, strange, singular, unique, out of this world. Young's fiction contains no shortage of eccentricities. It is textured with failed utopian communities, angel sightings, and surreal folk tales she recalled from her childhood in Indiana. Encountering her work last winter allowed me to conceive of the Midwest as a land whose creative bounty was often overlooked, a place still waiting in its fullness to be discovered. And it reminded me of the richness that can emerge when a writer refuses to filter her experience through familiar tropes and instead strives to see through fresh eyes what lies right in front of her nose. For Young, the local always concealed the universal. She told the Paris Review in 1977, Indiana is a land rich in legend. I tried to transmute this legend into a universal and cosmic statement of some kind. I think all writers have the impulse to generalize, to make their stories expansive, extending beyond their immediate surroundings. And yet the generalization that Young alludes to here is not one of whitewashing or reiterating stereotypes, which is, on the contrary, a kind of narrowness. It is a call to take what is singular about a place and endow it with the scope of the epic and the timelessness of myth. What does it mean for the Midwest to be Xanadu or Byzantium? Young doesn't explain these allusions, though it would be a mistake to assume she's calling on Midwesterners to find their identity in exotic fictions. She's arguing, I think, that the region is as fantastic as any of these mythological sites, or rather, it is all of them at once. The Midwest of everywhere is a quantum space, a region of coexisting and distinct realities. It already exists, but for it to be reflected in our literature, we must expand the narrow and familiar archetypes that so often define us. This is not just an aesthetic project, but a political one. It requires privileging voices that have been historically marginalized and ensuring that our regional literature reflects the diversity of communities that occupy these states. What picture of the region might emerge from this mosaic of experience? Certainly it will not be one as familiar as Main Street or Middletown or the television set of Roseanne. But I suspect that the Midwest of everywhere could be a place more colorful, more humane, and more creatively yielding than these existing archetypes, and more true to life than the real America. I imagine, moreover, that when writers focus on the particulars of their experience, there will emerge connections between our work, ideas that unite us as a region, even as they diverge from the ruling stereotypes. This is no easy task, but I have found some relief in Young's insistence that the best regional writers, just like the best artists throughout history, work from the ground up, that we should not look to others to determine our identity, but instead bore deep into this local soil that has proved fertile to so many writers before. Toil it with diligence, attention, and care. See what it yields. Thank you.
One common theme among the four of you is that fiction and literature have something to reveal to us that we might not otherwise have seen. And you all believe that you have seen it. And I'm wondering...
Or we're at least trying really hard to see it, yeah.
We haven't seen it because the accounts of history that provide the analysis of the conditions that the characters are dealing with have failed to be complete enough with regard to those conditions, or the accounts of psychology that our common sense view of the world we rely on have failed to provide the complete analysis of that person's motivations. Is that why literature surprises us? Because we're relying on research methods and common sense views of the world that come through us through academia, history and psychology.
Yeah, so you're asking if is that what the creative arts are going to be able to do to add? I mean, I love the idea that we're just part of the. I love being at a history conference. That we're part of it. I don't know about you all, but everything I know about the French Revolution, I learned from reading A Tale of Two Cities. I think we learn, and I do a lot of research, and I find a lot of the research I need to do, I find in Willa Cather, and I find in Little Laura Ingalls Wilder of the work I have to do.
Yeah, I would not single out academia or psychology or history as the source of the paradigms that cause us to not see stuff well. I would blame bad fiction just as much. I mean, that's a point that Megan's essay brought out really well. Yeah, like stupid TV shows and bad novels. I think it's more just something inherent in this is a cop-out answer, but it's inherent in the human condition that we can't, we see through a dark glass darkly, blah, blah, blah. So I'd locate it there.
And we find different truths through these different methods. I think that all add up, and if everybody is looking for all the different kinds of truths and information, then we will get a more complete picture.
Just raise my hand right here. Yeah.
Do it.
Fine by me.
I know Phil teaches at University of Michigan. I don't know if did the others teach writing. Do you notice any change in students in the last 5, 10, 20 years? And how might all attention to social media and so forth have possibly affected that, if it's changed at all?
So I have kind of a different perspective. I don't teach in academia. I run a community writing center, basically, the Lafayette Writers Studio in Lafayette, Indiana. So I have a really diverse body of students. So in a class, I might have a high school student with a graduate student in engineering, a stay-at-home mom, and a retiree. And if anything, what I've discovered in the nearly 5 years that I've been doing this is there's a real interest in sharing stories. The people that tend to gravitate toward a writing class are there because they want to learn about themselves. They want to share parts of themselves as well. And I don't know if that is something that is transpired over the past, 10 or 12 years, as your question asked. But
I teach writing online also, and it's sort of the same demographic. It's a very diverse group of students from all over the country. And, I think there is, like Melissa was saying, there is sort of a renewed interest in people telling their stories from like a personal angle. I think personal writing is very huge right now, and a lot of places, even big magazines that used to only publish journalism are trying to find more personal writing. And as far as, and I have a lot of students that are like writing their family history, so they're very, engaged with history and genealogy. And a lot of students too that are like from the middle of the country, who are taking these online classes. I think maybe to answer your question about social media, I feel like it used to be the case that you would have to go somewhere like New York, if you wanted to make it big. And now, I guess one benefit of these platforms is that you can sort of promote your work, outside of an urban setting. There's obviously many drawbacks to those platforms as well, including distraction and all sorts of things. But I think that's a benefit for sure.
I mean, I don't know whether any of you would have heard of me if it weren't for Twitter. That's where I met the editor that commissioned the essay that got me here. So I haven't taught long enough to speak to generational differences. I've been in the classroom since 2005, and the differences that I see among students have more to do with teaching in different types of educational settings. I don't see huge differences in intelligence. I see differences in preparedness, but it's more a matter of like which things are students unprepared about change than that students become more unprepared on average over time. And I will say that something that I think is eroding my students right now at U of M, which is an elite university and attracts a lot of people who are either from the upper middle class already and anxious about staying there, or who are upwardly mobile. One thing that I do see that sets that group apart from other groups of students I've taught, and in a way that is detrimental to their intellectual development, is that they're terrified. They are so scared of what will happen if they don't get into the business school. They are so scared of what will happen if they don't network just right. They are so scared of what will happen if they don't land the best internship the summer after freshman year, because the economy it's getting nastier and nastier. And that fear doesn't leave a lot of room for knowledge just for the sake of knowledge. It regularly makes me very angry. I feel like I don't blame social media for making them less intellectual. I blame neoliberalism, and I get very heated on the subject at times, so I'll cut myself off.
Yeah, I know. This is such an interesting question. I'm thinking about 6 different things, and I'm not going to mention any of them, but if anybody wants to talk to me afterwards. Yeah, and you had a question.
Hi, I just had a question about, so part of why some of us are here to find out how to fit our research into Midwestern history. And so I was wondering, you mentioned about using historians' research. So what do we need to do to help you, right? So what can we do?
We need a database.
Right, so what is, as some of us are starting to think about new projects or ways we can sort of readjust our research agendas, what would be useful?
I wish there were a database letting me as a person I teach sometimes, but I'm not in a university, so I don't have access to academic stuff. But I write a lot of stories that have a lot of things that I cannot find the information on. And I think somebody has written about how medicine has changed in the Midwest, and especially in Michigan. How medicine has changed, what things used to be done by doctors, what things are no longer done by doctors, what things traditionally were done by paraprofessionals. Okay, that's just one example. I know somebody is doing research on that, but I can't get in touch with the person who's doing the research on that subject. And like I mentioned before, I'm very interested in that time period 1820 to 1840, when there was a lot of interaction between Native Americans and white settlers. Hugely interesting. I can't find anybody who's doing, because I don't know where to look. I'm very interested in black farmers in the Midwest. I don't know where to look for that information. So if there were a way to let us creative writers who want to get it right, to get us in touch with those of you who are finding out the information, and then I don't know what you get from us. You get a little mention in our book, you know, but a lot of gratitude.
Even just like a really, really comprehensive, crowdsourced, free online annotated bibliography. If you want this kind of thing, go read this, find a way to get a hold of this article, because if you can usually find a PDF if you look hard enough, even if you don't have the database access. Like, that would be a start.
Oh, go ahead.
Yeah. I was rereading Winesburg, Ohio, a while back.
Woo!
And,
Rock on.
and I'm a geographer, so I'm very interested in this idea of place and region and defining what defines a place. And as I was reading that, within that context, thinking about the Midwest as place, I was thinking about the idea that one of the leitmotifs that binds together all his grotesques is this idea of sort of a fatalistic nostalgia for something that never was. So this idea of a constructed reality. And what do you all think? Do you think that we Midwesterners and maybe even people outside the Midwest construct our own identity based on something that maybe never really was, but what we hoped it would be? And maybe in light of this past election, maybe that had something to do with that. I don't know.
What was the book again? Winesburg, Ohio.
Sherwood Anderson's Winesburg, Ohio.
I know, this is such a big subject,
It is a big
isn't
question.
it?
Big subject, yeah.
I'm going to talk first unless somebody jumps ahead of me.
Yeah, go for it.
I hate to be the guy that let me explain things.
If you talk too much, I can take you.
Please do, seriously. I just keep thinking about the fact that there's fascist organizing in my state. There's white supremacists keep coming in from like the suburbs and from like Howell and places like that and putting their stupid little flyers on my campus. And I mean, fascism in Michigan would not make sense to people who had any idea who they are, right? I mean, the idea of a Volk in this country is so transparently stupid. If there is a Volk that owns the United States, we've confined them mostly on reservations. I mean, it's such a bad fantasy novel. So yeah, I think it's very clearly the case that there's a kind of racist white nationalist narrative that comes from that people have kind of cobbled together that seems to appeal to a lot of folks in my state, and that makes me, very angry and frightened.
I wrote a piece that was kind of about nostalgia in the Midwest last year. I wrote about Greenfield Village, which was Henry Ford's recreated. I'm sure you know about it. I'm in Dearborn, Michigan. Henry Ford made this this village where he basically transported all of it. Was a project of nostalgia. He basically transported all of these buildings from that he remembered from his childhood, his first machine shop and his one-room schoolhouse, and basically tried to recreate the land of his boyhood. It was a total fabrication. And not to mention there's all this irony too, that he was recreating this sort of very bucolic version of America before the Industrial Revolution that he himself ushered in, so he's recreating this recreating this version of America that he had helped destroy through industrialization. I went there right during the lead up to the 2016 election with my family, and it was really bizarre. And Greenfield Village, it's interesting because a lot of places in Michigan, tourist sites have had a dip in attendance since the recession, and Greenfield Village has actually spiked since then. So there's a real hunger for this sort of old, very nostalgic version of America there, and a lot of interesting resonances too. I didn't get to put this in the essay between Henry Ford and Donald Trump. He was seen as a sort of working class hero, even though he was a millionaire, that a lot of his workers really looked up to, and so I don't know. I think I definitely see it. I think nostalgia, I guess, is something that's always been part of our culture here in the Midwest, and always problematic in many ways.
I'm supposed to announce that I am the last question. I just want to say, though, just to make a comment about the announcement about the car with the lights on. I think it is very Midwestern that you didn't just end with, so if you could please go and check on your car. You actually stated, we will help you, jump your car. And that is so Midwestern. So, and I'm speaking as a transplant. But one of the things that struck me last year at this conference was the discussion in academia about Midwestern historians when they are on a job search or within academia, that they are oftentimes compelled to sort of hide that they're Midwestern historians in order to get the job, and that they will disguise the nature of their Midwestern research with particular buzzwords that don't necessarily out them as being Midwestern historians. So
they can talk about rural versus urban.
Exactly. So I was wondering if, as writers, you ever feel like you need to sort of hide your Midwestern affinity in order to maybe appeal to more of a mass market, or to appeal to your editors or what have you.
Yeah, I think that's interesting because certainly there's a similar effect taking place in publishing, and that is, who are these gatekeepers? So it depends. I mean, I think we're all with different presses.
You think it's changing?
I do. I think there is more of an interest in the Midwest. Maybe this goes back to the very start of our panel here. When I was searching for a home for Glory Days, and I approached, several 90-some agents, they all just said, this is interesting. Are you working on something else? And yet, when I shifted gears, it's that was 5 years of my life. When I shifted gears and started approaching university presses and indie presses, that's when I got some real traction and some real collaboration and folks that were interested in helping me, so to speak, because they don't have the same limitations as a New York press. And I don't know, maybe I'm putting words in New York City's lap, but I don't know if your experience has been different, Megan.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I sort of alluded to my experience. I felt like I had the opposite thing with, right after the election, there was suddenly I felt like I got lucky in a way because there was all this interest in the Midwest. But I talked to another writer just a few weeks ago who said he had the opposite experience where he's like, nobody wants to hear about the Midwest right now. Everybody's pissed at the Midwest and nobody wanted to read his collection. So I think it's a case-by-case thing, depends on the publishing house. But I agree, I think it's really cool to see, I think somebody mentioned Belt Publishing, which is a small indie press out of Ohio. There's sort of these more local independent presses that are creating a platform for writers who are kind of outside that New York, publishing community. And I think that's one of the most exciting things that's happening right now in Midwestern writing is sort of these more local presses and platforms that are giving voice to writers outside that community.
Another round of applause.